It's April 1876 in a narrow gulch in the Black Hills of what would become South Dakota. Around you, somewhere between 5,000 and 25,000 people are living in a town that, legally speaking, doesn't exist. There's no mayor, no marshal, no laws, no courts, because this entire camp is built on stolen land, deep in Indian territory, in violation of a federal treaty signed just 8 years earlier. And nobody cares, because 6 months ago, men found gold in this creek. And when men find gold, laws stop mattering. Welcome to Deadwood Gulch, one of the most lawless towns in American history. Settle in. We're going to tell you the story of how this impossible place came to be, how thousands of people carved a town out of a canyon so narrow that buildings hung over the creek on stilts, how smallpox, fire, and murder became daily occurrences, and how one of the most famous gunfighters of the Old West walked into a saloon, sat down for a poker game with his back to the door for the first time in years, and paid for that mistake with his life. This is the story of Deadwood, and the real story is bloodier than any HBO series could ever show you. To understand Deadwood, we have to go back 8 years earlier to 1868. The United States government signed the Fort Laramie Treaty with the Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations. The treaty was crystal clear. The Black Hills, a sacred region the Lakota called Paha Sapa, meaning hills that are black, belonged to the Great Sioux Reservation. Forever. White settlers were explicitly forbidden from entering. Article 2 stated that the land would be set apart for the absolute and undisturbed use and occupation of the Sioux. Article 12 made it a crime for any white person to enter the reservation without permission. It was a solemn promise, signed by President Andrew Johnson, ratified by the U.S. Senate. It lasted exactly 6 years. In July 1874, Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, yes, that Custer, led an expedition of over 1,000 men, including cavalry, infantry, scientists, miners, and newspaper correspondents, into the Black Hills. Officially, it was a military reconnaissance and scientific survey. Unofficially, everyone knew he was looking for gold, and he found it. On July 30th, 1874, miners with Custer's expedition discovered gold in French Creek. Custer sent a dispatch to Fort Laramie. Gold has been found at several places, and it is the belief of those who are giving their attention to this subject that it will be found in paying quantities. The newspapers ran wild with the story. "Gold!" screamed the headlines. "The land of promise!" Stirring news from the Black Hills. By late 1874, the first illegal prospectors were sneaking into Lakota territory. The Army tried to stop them. Troops from Fort Laramie would arrest miners, confiscate their equipment, and escort them back across the border. The miners would wait a week, then sneak right back in. By spring 1875, hundreds of miners were flooding into the Black Hills. The Army couldn't stop them. There weren't enough troops, and public opinion had turned against enforcement. Why should the government protect savage Indian lands when American citizens wanted to prospect for gold? In September 1875, the U.S. government attempted to buy the Black Hills from the Sioux. The asking price from the Lakota, $70 million, an astronomical sum worth over $1.9 billion today. The government offered $6 million. The Lakota refused, so the government simply took them. On December 6, 1875, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs issued an order. All Lakota must report to their designated agencies by January 31, 1876, or be considered hostile and subject to military action. It was midwinter. Many Lakota bands were hundreds of miles from the agencies. Some never received the order. Others, like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, refused on principle. They had not violated the treaty. The U.S. government had. The deadline passed. The Army mobilized for war. By spring 1876, while the military prepared for the campaign that would lead to the Battle of Little Bighorn in June, something else was happening in a narrow gulch in the Black Hills. Deadwood was being born. Deadwood Gulch was, objectively, one of the worst places anyone could have chosen to build a town. The canyon measured only 250 to 300 feet wide at its base, barely enough room for a single street. The gulch walls rose steeply on both sides, some slopes exceeding 45 degrees, covered in dead-standing timber killed by fire years earlier. Hence the name Deadwood. Deadwood Creek ran directly through the center of town. In spring, snowmelt would swell the creek, and the water would rise 10 to 15 feet, flooding buildings and sometimes washing away entire structures. In 1883, a particularly bad flood destroyed 300 buildings in a matter of hours. There was barely room for one street, Main Street, running about a mile along the canyon floor. Buildings were crammed together with no space between them. Some structures were built on stilts directly over the creek. Others clung to the hillsides on precarious foundations, but none of that mattered. Because in December 1875, two prospectors, Frank Bryant and his partner, discovered gold-bearing gravel in the creek bed. Word spread rapidly through nearby camps. By April 1876, Deadwood had a few hundred residents. By summer, population estimates ranged wildly. Some contemporary accounts claimed 5,000 people. Others insisted it was 25,000. The reality was probably somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 at peak times, though the population fluctuated dramatically with the seasons. The town consisted of one main street running along the narrow canyon floor. But here's what made it truly chaotic. Miners staked placer claims directly in Main Street itself. They'd dig holes in the middle of the road, diverting the creek through sluice boxes, panning for gold while wagons tried to navigate around them. The street was described by one visitor as knee-deep in mud, full of stumps and boulders. Another wrote, "The main street of Deadwood is impassable for wagons, being full of large rocks and fallen trees." Tents and crude log cabins climbed the hillsides in no particular order. The wealthy, merchants and successful gamblers built frame houses, but lumber was scarce and expensive. Every board had to be hauled 75 to 100 miles from Custer City or Fort Pierre over terrible roads. A simple pine board that cost 5 cents elsewhere sold for 50 cents in Deadwood. The poor lived in canvas tents that offered zero protection from winter temperatures that regularly dropped to 20 or 30 below zero. Everything was built on stolen land, in open violation of federal law and treaty. But since the entire camp was illegal anyway, there were no property deeds, no legal ownership of anything. If you could hold a claim with your fists, your gun, or your reputation, it was yours. If you couldn't, someone would jump your claim, and there was nothing you could do about it. One miner wrote home, "This is the most lawless place I have ever seen. There is no law here except the law of might. It was frontier capitalism at its most raw, violent, chaotic, and utterly without rules. Who comes to a place like Deadwood? Miners, obviously. Men from every corner of America and beyond. Irish immigrants fresh off the boat, German prospectors from the California fields, Scandinavians from Minnesota, African Americans seeking opportunity in a place without slavery, Chinese immigrants fleeing violence in California. They came from everywhere. The 1880 census, taken after Deadwood became more established, showed residents from 38 different states and 16 foreign countries. But miners weren't the majority. Not even close. For every miner actually digging for gold, there were 3 or 4 people trying to separate that miner from his wealth. Within months of its founding, Deadwood had more than 75 saloons. That's one saloon for every 60 to 130 people, depending on population estimates, compared to the modern U.S. ratio of about 1 bar per 2,000 people. The most notorious was the Gem Theater, owned by Al Swearingen. Born in Iowa in 1845, Swearingen arrived in Deadwood in April 1876 with his wife Nettie. He built the Gem Variety Theater, part saloon, part gambling hall, part dance hall, part brothel. The Gem operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Swearingen employed between 20 and 30 women at any given time. Some were willing participants, many were not. There are documented cases of Swearingen or his men recruiting young women from eastern cities with promises of legitimate theater work, then forcing them into prostitution once they arrived in Deadwood. He controlled them through debt bondage, violence, and threats. One woman who escaped testified that Swearingen had beaten her repeatedly and threatened to kill her if she tried to leave. Contemporary accounts describe the Gem's cribs, tiny rooms where the women lived and worked, as barely big enough for a bed. Swearingen himself was described as physically imposing, over 6 feet tall, heavily muscled, and extremely violent. He was arrested multiple times for assault, but never convicted. In Deadwood's early years, violence against prostitutes wasn't considered a serious crime. But the Gem was far from the only establishment. The Senate Saloon, the Bella Union, the Cricket, the Melodeon, all competed for miners' gold dust. Whiskey sold for 50 cents a shot, worth about $15 today, payable in gold dust weighed on scales behind the bar. Bartenders were notorious for having heavy thumbs when weighing. Gamblers worked the saloons in fine clothes with expensive jewelry, looking for drunk miners with full pokes. Faro, poker, 3-card Monte, roulette, any game you could imagine. Professional gamblers would often work in teams, one playing while Confederates watched for easy marks or signaled opponents' cards. Merchants sold supplies at outrageous markups. Flour that cost $2 a hundredweight elsewhere went for $20 in Deadwood. Eggs were $1 each. A potato cost 25 cents. Everything had to be freighted in over terrible roads, which justified some of the markup. But merchants also charged what the market would bear, and desperate miners would pay anything. There were legitimate businesses, too. By summer 1876, Deadwood had hardware stores, butcher shops, bakeries, blacksmiths, a drugstore, and multiple hotels. The Grand Central Hotel advertised the finest accommodations in the Black Hills, with beds that cost $1 a night. Actual beds, not just floor space. A newspaper, the Black Hills Pioneer, started publishing on June 8, 1876, barely 2 months after the camp was founded. The first issue proclaimed, "We have come to stay, and the Pioneer will be published regularly hereafter." It's still publishing today, making it one of the oldest continuously operating newspapers in South Dakota. There were also significant communities of Chinese and African American residents. The 1880 census counted 255 Chinese residents, though the actual number in 1876 was probably higher. They worked as laundrymen, cooks, restaurant owners, and miners, though Chinese miners were often forced to work abandoned claims white miners had given up on. African American cowboys, freighters, and entrepreneurs also came to Deadwood. Lucretia, Aunt Lou Marchbanks, ran a restaurant and later a brothel. Nat Love, the famous black cowboy who would later write his autobiography, visited Deadwood in the late 1870s and won a roping contest there. And then there were the outlaws. With no law enforcement, no courts, and no legal system, Deadwood became a magnet for men running from justice, horse thieves from Wyoming, claim jumpers from Montana, murderers from Kansas cow towns, men who'd been run out of Virginia City or Tombstone, but figured they could blend in here. One contemporary observer described Deadwood's population this way: Miners, merchants, saloon keepers, gamblers, desperados, broken men from every state in the Union and every country in the world. The Deadwood City Directory from 1877 listed occupations. Miners made up 32% of the recorded population. Merchants accounted for 18%. Saloon keepers and bartenders represented 15%. Gamblers made up 8%. Prostitutes listed as sporting women comprised 6%, and laborers accounted for 21%. But these numbers only counted people who stayed long enough to be listed. Hundreds more drifted through constantly. It wasn't entirely fair to call everyone scum. Plenty of decent people lived in Deadwood, families, hardworking miners, honest merchants trying to build something lasting. But the town's reputation was well earned. This was a place where violence was commonplace and life was cheap. So what was it actually like to live in Deadwood in 1876? Crowded, noisy, filthy, dangerous, and expensive beyond belief. The town ran 24 hours a day. Saloons never closed. Gambling continued around the clock. Music from dance halls and variety theaters mixed with the constant sound of hammering. Everyone was building something. One visitor described the noise. The sound of hammers, saws, the crashing of timber, and the shouts of men loading and unloading freight wagons never ceased, day or night. Add to this the music from a dozen saloons, the crack of pistol shots, and the occasional scream, and you have some idea of Deadwood at night. Sanitation was non-existent. People threw garbage directly into the street. Dead animals were left where they fell. Outhouses, when they existed, dumped directly into Deadwood Creek, the same creek where people drew drinking water downstream. One health inspector who visited in 1877 wrote, "The sanitary condition of Deadwood is deplorable. Filth of every description accumulates in the streets. Dead animals lie rotting in plain view. The creek is an open sewer. It is a wonder the entire population has not been carried off by disease." The smell must have been overwhelming, particularly in summer. Fire was a constant, terrifying threat. Buildings were primarily wood and canvas, packed tightly together, heated by wood stoves and lit by oil lamps and candles. There was no organized fire department and no reliable water source for firefighting. The first major fire struck on September 26, 1879, destroying much of the business district. Contemporary accounts describe flames spreading so rapidly that people barely escaped with their lives. 300 buildings burned in a matter of hours. Property damage was estimated at $3 million, worth about $90 million today. Deadwood burned again in 1894, and several smaller fires destroyed portions of the town in between. And then there was the violence. In a town with no law enforcement and no courts, disputes were settled with fists or firearms. Arguments over mining claims led to shootouts. Drunken gamblers pulled knives over card games. Prostitutes were beaten or murdered with shocking regularity. The exact murder rate is impossible to determine. There was no official record keeping. But we can piece together some numbers from contemporary newspaper accounts and cemetery records. The Black Hills Pioneer reported at least 47 murders in Deadwood and its immediate vicinity between April 1876 and December 1877, about 20 months. That's roughly 2.3 murders per month, or one every 13 days. But these were only the murders the newspaper knew about. Bodies found weeks later in gulches. Chinese or Native Americans killed, but never reported. Suicides that were probably murders. The real number was almost certainly higher, possibly 70 to 100 murders in Deadwood's first 2 years. For comparison, in 2019, a city of 10,000 people in the United States would average about 1 murder per year. Deadwood in 1876 had roughly 30 to 50 times the modern murder rate. Most violence wasn't the Hollywood shootout, 2 gunslingers facing off at high noon. It was uglier than that. Men shot in the back over gambling debts, claim jumpers murdered in their sleep, prostitutes killed by customers or pimps, their bodies dumped in the creek, robberies that turned deadly, drunken arguments that escalated to knives. One particularly brutal incident. In June 1876, a gambler named Harry Houghton got into an argument with another man over a poker game. Houghton shot the man in the stomach. The victim lingered for 3 agonizing days before dying. Houghton was arrested by the miners' court, but released when witnesses couldn't agree on who had drawn first. Another case. A Chinese man known as Chinaman Sam was found beaten to death in an alley in July 1876. No investigation was ever conducted. His murder was never mentioned in the newspaper. We only know about it because his name appears in cemetery records. This was the reality of Deadwood. If you were white, male, and respected, your murder might be investigated. If you were Chinese, Native American, a woman, or poor, your death might not even be recorded. Bodies were buried on a hillside above town in what would become Mount Moriah Cemetery. The cemetery expanded rapidly, so rapidly that plots weren't properly organized. People were buried wherever space was available. Many graves were never marked. By the end of 1877, Mount Moriah contained at least 300 graves. By 1880, over 500, and these numbers only include people who received formal burial. Others were buried in unmarked graves throughout the gulch or simply left where they died. The most famous murder in Deadwood. On August 2nd, 1876, barely 4 months after Deadwood was founded, a man walked into Nuttall and Mann Saloon No. 10 around 3 p.m. His name was James Butler Hickok, but everyone knew him as Wild Bill. Wild Bill Hickok was 39 years old and already a living legend. Born in Illinois in 1837, he'd worked as a Union scout during the Civil War, a lawman in Kansas cowtowns, Hays City and Abilene, and a performer in Buffalo Bill Cody's traveling show. Dime novels had made him famous across America as the greatest gunfighter who ever lived. Stories claimed he'd killed dozens of men in fair fights. The reality was more modest. Hickok had killed at least 7 men, possibly as many as 12 over his lifetime. Some were fair fights, some weren't. He'd been shot multiple times, stabbed, beaten. His eyesight was deteriorating, possibly glaucoma or trachoma. At 39, he was worn out, drinking heavily, and his glory days were behind him. He'd arrived in Deadwood in mid-July with a wagon train that included his friend Colorado Charlie Utter and a woman named Martha Jane Canary, better known as Calamity Jane. They'd traveled from Cheyenne, Wyoming, hoping to strike it rich in the Black Hills. Hickok brought his young wife Agnes with him. They'd married just months earlier in March 1876, but Agnes hated Deadwood and returned to Cincinnati after only a few weeks. Hickok stayed, trying to make money through gambling rather than mining. He didn't find much success at either. On Wednesday afternoon, August 2nd, Hickok entered Nuttall and Mann Saloon No. 10 for his regular poker game. The saloon was a rough establishment, a long, narrow room with a bar on one side, gambling tables scattered throughout, and a back door leading to an alley. Hickok always followed one rule: sit with your back to the wall. Years of making enemies had taught him never to present an easy target. But on this day, another player, Charles Rich, a professional gambler, was already sitting in Hickok's preferred seat with his back to the wall. Wild Bill asked him to move. Rich refused. "Come on, Bill. Play wherever there's an empty chair." Hickok hesitated. Every instinct told him not to sit with his back to the door, but he didn't want to make a scene, so he shrugged and took the only open chair, facing the wall, his back to the main entrance. It was a fatal mistake. The poker game included Wild Bill Hickok, Charles Rich, Carl Mann, co-owner of the saloon, and a river pilot named William Massey. They were playing 5-card stud, betting with gold dust and poker chips. Around 4 p.m., a drifter named Jack McCall walked in. John. Jack McCall was 25 years old, from Kentucky originally, a small-time gambler and nothing special, not particularly dangerous, not particularly important. He'd been in Deadwood for several weeks, gambling without much success. The night before, August 1st, McCall had lost heavily to Hickok in a poker game. Sources vary on the amount, but probably $5 to $10 in gold dust. After the game, Hickok had done something unusual. Seeing McCall was broke, he'd given him money for breakfast. Some sources say 50 cents, others say $1. "Go get something to eat," Hickok told him. This act of kindness apparently enraged McCall. Why? Nobody knows for certain. Some men can't stand being pitied. Some historians speculate McCall felt humiliated, taking charity from the great Wild Bill Hickok in front of other gamblers. Whatever the reason, McCall decided Hickok had to die. On the afternoon of August 2nd, McCall borrowed or purchased a .45 caliber Colt revolver, possibly a Colt Model 1860 Army, though sources conflict. He loaded only one chamber. Whether this was intentional or because he only had one cartridge is unknown. Around 4:15 p.m., McCall entered Nuttall and Mann's through the front door. He walked quietly through the saloon toward the poker table where Hickok sat with his back to the room. McCall approached to within a few feet. He drew the revolver. According to witnesses, McCall shouted, "Damn you! Take that!" He pressed the muzzle against the back of Wild Bill's head, just below the skull, and pulled the trigger. The bullet, likely a .45 long Colt round, entered Hickok's skull at the base, just below the occipital bone. It traveled upward through his brain, passed through the parietal lobe, and exited below his right cheekbone, taking bone and tissue with it. The bullet continued across the table and struck Captain William Massey in the left wrist, breaking both radius and ulna bones. Wild Bill Hickok died instantly. He pitched forward, his cards scattering across the table. According to legend, and this part is well documented in contemporary accounts, Hickok's final hand was a pair of black aces, spades and clubs, and a pair of black eights, spades and clubs. The fifth card is disputed. Some say it was the Queen of Hearts, others the Queen of Diamonds, still others the Nine of Diamonds. Forever after, aces and eights would be known as the dead man's hand. Jack McCall tried to escape. He pulled the trigger on other patrons as he ran, but his pistol misfired repeatedly. Only one chamber had been loaded, and that round had killed Hickok. "Oh, don't shoot!" McCall shouted as he ran for the back door. He burst into the alley, tried to steal a horse, but the saddle wasn't secured properly and he fell off, landing hard in the mud. Bystanders grabbed him within minutes. A mob formed quickly. Hundreds of angry miners who'd liked Wild Bill, or at least respected his reputation. "Lynch him!" someone shouted. "String him up!" But cooler heads prevailed. Barely. They locked McCall in a cabin under guard while the town decided what to do. Now Deadwood faced a serious problem. They had a murderer. They had dozens of witnesses, including 3 men sitting at the poker table when it happened. They had caught him red-handed, still holding the murder weapon, but they had no jail, no legal authority, no court, no actual right to hold a trial at all, because Deadwood existed in Indian Territory, outside any legal jurisdiction. The United States had no authority here. Technically, this was still Sioux land under the Fort Laramie Treaty. Never mind that the U.S. was actively violating that treaty. Some miners wanted to lynch McCall immediately. Others argued for a proper trial. The debate raged through the night of August 2nd to 3rd. Finally, they decided to hold a miners' court, an informal legal proceeding common in frontier camps without official law. These courts had no legal standing whatsoever, but they were all Deadwood had. On August 3rd, 1876, less than 24 hours after the murder, Deadwood convened its trial. They selected Judge W. L. Kuykendall to preside. They impaneled a jury of 12 minors. They appointed a prosecutor and allowed McCall to defend himself. He had no attorney. The trial was held in the largest building available, McDaniel's Theater, a variety hall and gambling establishment on Main Street. Hundreds of people crowded in to watch. The prosecution called witnesses. Charles Rich, Carl Mann, and William Massey all testified to what they'd seen. McCall walking up behind Hickok and shooting him in the head at point-blank range. The evidence was overwhelming and undisputed. Then, McCall took the stand to defend himself. He claimed Wild Bill Hickok had killed his brother years earlier in Abilene, Kansas, and he was avenging that death. Wild Bill killed my brother, McCall testified. I came here to kill him, and I did it. I have no regrets. My brother can rest now. It was almost certainly a complete lie. No evidence has ever been found that McCall had a brother, much less one killed by Hickok in Kansas. The story was probably invented on the spot or suggested by someone who wanted McCall acquitted, but it didn't matter. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They returned a verdict. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered. They viewed the verdict as a proper assertion of frontier independence. Others were furious. This was clearly murder, witnessed by dozens. The decision shocked even Deadwood's jaded residents. Theories immediately circulated about why McCall was acquitted. Some suspected McCall had been paid by gambling interests who wanted Hickok dead, perhaps Al Swearingen or other saloon owners who feared Hickok might become a lawman and crack down on their operations. Others thought the jury simply wanted to assert Deadwood's independence, to prove that no man, not even the famous Wild Bill Hickok, was above the rough justice of the camp. If they'd convicted McCall, it would have been an admission that Hickok was special, that his life mattered more than others. Still others believed the brother revenge story had been persuasive enough, even without evidence, to create reasonable doubt in the minds of men who understood frontier justice. Whatever the reason, Jack McCall walked free on August 3, 1876. He left Deadwood almost immediately, knowing that while the court had acquitted him, plenty of Hickok's friends hadn't. Colorado Charlie Utter had publicly sworn vengeance. Others were looking for McCall with ropes. McCall fled to Wyoming Territory, then to Laramie City, where he made a fatal mistake. He started bragging about killing Wild Bill Hickok. U.S. Marshal's deputies heard these boasts and realized something crucial. Deadwood's trial had no legal standing. The camp existed in Indian Territory outside any legal jurisdiction. That meant McCall had never been legally tried for murder. Double jeopardy didn't apply because the Deadwood trial was invalid. Marshals arrested McCall in Laramie on August 29, 1876, and transported him to Yankton, Dakota Territory, the territorial capital and seat of actual legal authority. McCall was held in the Dakota Territorial Penitentiary while awaiting trial. This time, he faced a real court with actual legal authority, a territorial judge, a prosecuting attorney, defense counsel, proper procedures. The trial began on December 4, 1876, in Yankton. The same witnesses testified, Rich, Mann, Massey, describing the murder. This time there was no sympathetic frontier jury willing to accept a revenge story without evidence. The prosecution demonstrated that McCall had no brother, that his entire defense was fabricated. After 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: guilty of murder. Judge P.C. Shannon sentenced Jack McCall to death by hanging. On March 1, 1877, at 10:15 a.m., Jack McCall was led to the gallows in Yankton. A crowd of several hundred gathered to watch. McCall was visibly terrified. He trembled as the noose was placed around his neck. When asked if he had any final words, he reportedly said, "Draw it tight, Marshal. I have nothing to say." The trap door opened. McCall dropped. His neck didn't break. The fall wasn't quite long enough. so he strangled slowly, dying over several minutes. He was buried in the prison cemetery wearing the same clothes and with the rope still around his neck. Years later, when the cemetery was relocated, McCall's body was exhumed. The rope was still there, partially preserved in the soil. Jack McCall killed the most famous gunfighter in America and lived exactly 211 days afterward. Wild Bill's funeral. On August 3, 1876, the same day McCall was acquitted, Wild Bill Hickok was buried in Deadwood's Ingleside Cemetery, later moved to Mount Moriah. His friend Colorado Charlie Utter organized and paid for the funeral. Utter purchased the finest coffin available in Deadwood, which wasn't saying much. It was a simple pine box, but Utter had it lined with white cloth and placed Hickok's rifle alongside him in the coffin. Several hundred people attended the funeral, a significant portion of Deadwood's population. Whatever people thought of Hickok personally, he was famous, and his murder had shocked the camp. Utter erected a wooden marker with a lengthy epitaph, Wild Bill, J.B. Hickok killed by the assassin Jack McCall in Deadwood, Black Hills, August 2nd, 1876. Pard, we will meet again in the happy hunting ground to part no more. Goodbye, Colorado Charlie, C.H. Utter. Calamity Jane. Martha Jane Cannery made sure everyone knew she'd been Hickok's companion and lover. The truth is more complicated. Jane probably knew Hickok, but whether they were romantically involved is disputed. Contemporary sources suggest Hickok found her crude and avoided her company. But Jane spent the rest of her life claiming she'd been Wild Bill's great love. When she died in 1903 at age 51, worn out by alcoholism and poverty, she requested burial next to Hickok in Mount Moriah Cemetery. Her request was granted. Whether Hickok would have wanted that is anyone's guess. Hickok's grave became an immediate tourist attraction. People would chip pieces off the wooden marker as souvenirs until the entire marker disappeared. Utter replaced it multiple times. Eventually, a permanent stone marker was erected. Today, Hickok's grave in Mount Moriah Cemetery is one of the most visited sites in Deadwood, receiving tens of thousands of visitors annually. A bust of Hickok overlooks the grave, and the site is enclosed by an ornate iron fence. The spot where he was murdered, Saloon No. 10, burned in the 1879 fire, but a recreation now stands nearby, complete with a marker claiming Wild Bill was shot here. The actual location was slightly different, but tourists don't care. Wild Bill Hickok's death put Deadwood on the map. Newspapers across America covered the story. The murder of a legend in a lawless camp that shouldn't exist. It was irresistible, and it turned Deadwood from just another rough mining camp into American mythology. But Deadwood's story was far from over. In fact, within weeks, the camp would face something far deadlier than any gunfighter, an invisible killer that would fill the cemetery far faster than all the shootouts combined. The plague. In September 1876, just weeks after Hickok's murder, smallpox arrived in Deadwood. It's unclear exactly how. Probably brought in by a traveler from another mining camp where the disease was already spreading. Maybe from an infected blanket traded or sold. The disease was endemic across the frontier in the 1870s, sweeping through communities with terrifying regularity. In a modern city with sanitation and medical facilities, smallpox is terrible. In a cramped mining camp with no sanitation, no hospital, no medical infrastructure, and thousands of people living on top of each other, it was a death sentence. The disease spread like wildfire through the narrow canyon. The symptoms followed a predictable, horrifying pattern. First came fever, brutal, unrelenting, climbing to 104 or 105 degrees. Then severe body aches and exhaustion. Then the rash appeared. It started in the mouth and throat, then spread to the face and arms, then the trunk and legs. Within days, the rash developed into raised bumps, then fluid-filled blisters, then pustules that covered the victim from head to toe. The pustules were particularly concentrated on the face, hands, and feet. The pain was excruciating. Victims couldn't lie down comfortably because every surface of their skin was covered in painful lesions. They couldn't eat because their mouths and throats were full of pustules. Many went blind temporarily or permanently. Then came the waiting. Either the pustules would begin to crust over and heal, a process taking 2 to 3 weeks, or the victim would develop the hemorrhagic form of smallpox, where blood would leak into the skin and organs. The hemorrhagic form was almost always fatal. Mortality rates for ordinary smallpox ranged from 20% to 30%. For the hemorrhagic form, nearly 100%. In Deadwood's Chinese community, already marginalized and living in the most crowded, unsanitary conditions in the worst part of town, the mortality rate may have reached 50% or higher. Entire families were wiped out, businesses closed, the already inadequate cemetery filled rapidly. Bodies were buried in mass graves when individual plots ran out. The disease showed no mercy and recognized no social class. Rich merchants died alongside poor miners, gamblers and prostitutes, shopkeepers and freighters, all were equally vulnerable. The wealthy fled to other camps if they could. They'd pack up in the middle of the night and leave, hoping to outrun the disease. Some succeeded. Others brought it with them, spreading smallpox to Custer City, Hill City, and other Black Hill settlements. The poor had nowhere to go. They stayed and died. A few people tried to help. Dr. S.S. Babcock, one of Deadwood's only legitimate physicians trained in actual medicine rather than frontier quackery, worked tirelessly to treat victims. But medicine in 1876 could do almost nothing against smallpox. There was no cure, no effective treatment. The only real defense was vaccination, inoculation with cowpox or weakened smallpox virus to create immunity. But vaccine supplies were scarce in Deadwood, and many people refused vaccination either because they didn't believe it worked or because they feared the procedure itself. Some people had been vaccinated earlier in life and had immunity. They were the lucky ones. They could nurse the sick without fear of infection. Most hadn't been vaccinated. They faced a terrible choice: risk infection by caring for sick family members or abandon them to die alone. Many chose to flee. Husbands abandoned sick wives. Parents left sick children. The bonds of family and friendship dissolved in the face of disease. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. The smell of death hung over the camp. Funeral processions to Mount Moriah Cemetery became a daily occurrence, sometimes multiple processions per day. The epidemic raged through fall and winter. October was particularly brutal. November saw no let-up. Even in December, with temperatures dropping below zero, people continued to die. It only finally burned out in early 1877, not because anyone stopped it, but because it ran out of victims. Either you'd caught it and died, caught it and survived with immunity, or you'd been vaccinated or naturally immune. Contemporary estimates of the death toll vary wildly. Anywhere from 300 to 1,000 people died in Deadwood's smallpox epidemic. The true number will never be known. There was no official death registry. No one was counting. The Black Hills Pioneer tried to keep track but eventually gave up, noting only that several more deaths from smallpox occurred without listing names. What we do know with certainty, smallpox killed far more people in Deadwood than all the gunfighters, gamblers, and murderers combined. In the 20 months between April 1876 and December 1877, the Black Hills Pioneer documented 47 murders. In just 4 months, September 1876 to January 1877, smallpox likely killed between 300 and 500 people. Some historians put the number even higher. That's the reality of the frontier that movies never show. The real killers weren't men with 6 guns wearing black hats. They were disease, fire, floods, winter cold, and accidents. For every man shot dead in a saloon, 10 died of smallpox, typhoid, dysentery, or pneumonia. For every dramatic shootout, 100 deaths came slowly, painfully, without glory or notice. By all rights, Deadwood should have died. The easily accessible gold in the creek played out quickly. By 1877, surface deposits were largely exhausted. Individual miners with nothing but pans and sluice boxes could no longer make a living. The smallpox epidemic had killed hundreds and driven away thousands more. At its nadir in late 1876 and early 1877, Deadwood's population may have dropped to fewer than 3,000 people, a fraction of its summer 1876 peak. The weather was brutal. Winter temperatures regularly dropped to 20 or 30 below zero in a canyon that trapped the cold. Snow could pile 6 feet deep, cutting off access to the outside world for weeks at a time. Supplies ran low, prices soared even higher than normal. And yet, Deadwood didn't die. It transformed. Because while the placer gold in the creek was gone, something far more valuable lay buried in the surrounding hills. Hard rock gold deposits, veins of gold-bearing quartz running deep underground, containing millions of dollars in precious metal. But extracting that gold required something individual prospectors didn't have: capital. Lots of it. Deep mining required industrial equipment, stamp mills to crush ore, smelters to extract gold, hoisting equipment to bring ore to the surface, pumps to keep mines from flooding, timber for shoring up tunnels. It required teams of workers operating on shifts around the clock. Individual miners couldn't do it, but corporations could. Enter the mining companies, and the most important was Homestake Mining Company. Homestake was founded in 1877 by a group of investors including George Hearst, yes, the father of newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst. Hearst had made fortunes in Nevada's Comstock lode and other western mining ventures. He knew gold when he saw it. Hearst and his partners purchased the Homestake claim from its original owners for $70,000, a huge sum, but pocket change compared to what they'd extract. The Homestake mine would become one of the richest gold mines in history. Between 1876 and its closure in 2002, Homestake extracted over 40 million ounces of gold from the Black Hills, worth over $80 billion at today's prices. At its peak in the 1930s and 1940s, Homestake employed over 2,000 workers and ran 3 shifts per day. The mine eventually reached a depth of 8,000 feet, the deepest gold mine in the Western Hemisphere. But in 1877, all that was still in the future. What mattered then was that serious money was arriving in Deadwood, and serious money meant permanent infrastructure. By 1879, Deadwood was becoming a real town. The United States had finally gained legal control over the Black Hills. The Lakota had been forced to cede the territory after their victory at Little Bighorn, proved strategically meaningless. In 1877, Congress simply passed a law taking the Black Hills, treaty or no treaty. With legal jurisdiction finally established, actual governance arrived. Deadwood got a mayor. The first election was held in 1877. A city council, a marshal, Seth Bullock, who would become famous as one of Deadwood's early lawmen. Laws, courts, property deeds, all the boring machinery of civilization that makes a place livable. The lawless camp was gone. In its place was an industrial mining town. The transformation wasn't immediate or smooth. Violence continued. Deadwood was still rough in the late 1870s and 1880s. But it was no longer lawless. Now when someone was murdered, there was an actual sheriff to investigate, actual courts to prosecute, actual jails to hold prisoners. The change was reflected in the murder rate. In 1876 to 1877, Deadwood averaged about 2 murders per month. By 1880, that number had dropped to about 1 murder every 3 months. By 1885, murders were rare enough to shock the community. Fires repeatedly destroyed sections of the town. Major blazes in 1879 and 1894 forced Deadwood to rebuild multiple times, but each time they built better. After the 1879 fire, the city passed ordinances requiring brick construction in the business district. The second generation of buildings was far more substantial than the first. Streets were graded and improved. A water system was installed, partly for drinking, but primarily for firefighting. The September 26, 1879 fire had been particularly devastating. It started around 6 a.m. in a bakery on Sherman Street. Strong winds fanned the flames, and within hours, 300 buildings had burned, almost the entire business district. Property damage was estimated at $3 million, about $90 million today. But miraculously, no one died in the fire. The whole town turned out to fight it, forming bucket brigades and dynamiting buildings to create fire breaks. Deadwood rebuilt within months. But this time, the new buildings were brick, not wood, stone, not canvas, built to last. The Gem Theater, Al Swearengen's notorious establishment, continued operating into the 1890s. But Swearengen's power was waning. As Deadwood gained legitimate government, his brutality became less tolerated. He was arrested multiple times for assault and eventually for white slavery, forcing women into prostitution. In 1899, Swearengen left Deadwood. He drifted to Denver, where in 1904 he either fell or was pushed from a second-story landing, striking his head on the streetcar tracks below. He died of his injuries, alone and penniless. Whether he fell accidentally, jumped in despair, or was murdered by someone with an old grudge, no one knows. The Denver police ruled it accidental death and didn't investigate further. The Chinese community, devastated by smallpox in 1876 to 1877, rebuilt and established a vibrant Chinatown district in the lower part of Deadwood. At its peak around 1890, over 250 Chinese residents lived in Deadwood, operating laundries, restaurants, general stores, and other businesses. Wong Fei Li, who arrived in Deadwood in 1876, built a successful business empire that included a general store and the Wing Tzu Emporium. Chinese New Year celebrations in Deadwood featured fireworks, dragon dances, and feasts that drew curious crowds from the white community. But the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 halted further immigration from China, and Deadwood's Chinese population gradually declined. By 1900, fewer than 100 Chinese residents remained. By 1940, the number was down to a handful. African American residents also established themselves in Deadwood's more settled era. Lucretia, Aunt Lou Marchbanks, became a successful businesswoman, running restaurants and later a brothel called the Diddleback. She was well known and respected. When she died in 1914, the Black Hills Weekly gave her a prominent obituary, unusual for a black woman who ran a brothel. By 1900, Deadwood looked nothing like the chaotic camp of 1876. The town had electric lights, installed in 1883, making Deadwood one of the first towns in the West with electricity. Telephone service arrived in 1879. Paved streets, running water, a professional fire department. The town that shouldn't have existed, built on stolen land in violation of federal law, had become permanent. If you visit Deadwood today, you can still see echoes of its violent birth. Mount Moriah Cemetery, on the hill above town, still holds the graves of Wild Bill Hickok and Calamity Jane. The cemetery is a tourist attraction now, with marked paths and informational plaques. Wild Bill's grave receives tens of thousands of visitors annually, many leaving coins and playing cards as tribute. But walk off the main paths and you'll find hundreds of unmarked graves. Miners, prostitutes, smallpox victims, people whose names were never recorded or whose wooden markers rotted away decades ago. One section contains Chinese graves, many with unique markers featuring Chinese characters. Another section holds the graves of prostitutes from the Red Light District, buried in a section called the Mount Moriah Outcast Cemetery. Main Street still runs along the narrow canyon floor, though it's paved now and lined with casinos. Yes, casinos. Gambling was legalized in Deadwood in 1989 to preserve the historic buildings and fund restoration. It created a strange situation where slot machines now fill the same saloons where Wild Bill drank. The modern casinos have names like Wild Bill's and Deadwood Dick's, trading on frontier nostalgia. On summer weekends, actors in period costume stage shootouts in the street for tourists. It's sanitized, commercialized history, a far cry from the brutal reality of 1876. Saloon No. 10 still operates, though not in its original location. That whole block burned in the 1879 fire. But a recreation stands at 657 Main Street, with a marker claiming Wild Bill was shot here. The actual location was slightly different, but tourists don't care. Inside, you can see the dead man's hand painted on the wall and a display of Hickok memorabilia. The Adams Museum, founded in 1930, houses artifacts from Deadwood's early years. Photos of the original camp show just how primitive it was. Crude shacks clinging to hillsides, muddy streets, rough-looking men staring at the camera with weathered faces. These weren't actors. These were the real people who lived through those years. The museum has Wild Bill's gun, poker chips from various saloons, a scale used to weigh gold dust, bottles from the smallpox epidemic, mining equipment, Chinese artifacts, pieces of the original buildings destroyed in fires. The Days of 76 Museum celebrates Deadwood's frontier history with displays on Native American culture. Ironic, given how Deadwood came to exist, mining techniques and Western artifacts. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about modern Deadwood is how small it is. The town's current population is only about 1,270 people. Far smaller than the 7,000 to 10,000 who crammed into the gulch in summer 1876. The gold is long gone. Homestake mining finally closed in 2002 after 125 years of operation, ending deep mining in the Black Hills. The massive mine workings, 8,000 feet deep with over 370 miles of tunnels, are now flooded. Plans exist to convert parts of the mine into the Sanford Underground Research Facility, studying particle physics and other sciences. What remains in Deadwood is history and memory and tourists, lots and lots of tourists. Over 1 million people visit Deadwood annually, drawn by its frontier mystique and the promise of casino gambling. They walk Main Street, visit Wild Bill's grave, watch the staged shootouts, drop coins in slot machines housed in historic buildings. It's sanitized frontier history. All the adventure with none of the disease, all the gambling with none of the exploitation, all the gunfighters with none of the real blood. But if you know where to look, traces of the real Deadwood still remain. Deadwood's legacy is complicated. On one hand, it represents everything romantic about the American frontier, the idea that people could create something from nothing, that individual courage and determination mattered, that the West was a place of freedom and possibility. The story of thousands of people building a town in a canyon where no town should exist, surviving smallpox and fire and flood, transforming a lawless camp into a permanent city. It's undeniably compelling. On the other hand, Deadwood also represents everything terrible about that same frontier. Violence, lawlessness, stolen land, racism, exploitation, and the casual destruction of indigenous peoples' sacred spaces. The Black Hills had been promised to the Lakota forever under the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. That promise lasted 8 years before Americans broke it because they found gold. Deadwood exists because of that betrayal. The Lakota never accepted the theft of the Black Hills. In 1980, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in United States v. Sioux Nation of Indians that the taking of the Black Hills was illegal and awarded the Sioux tribes $122 million in compensation, the original $17.5 million value plus interest. The Sioux tribes refused the money. They still refuse it. The settlement held in trust has grown to over $1 billion with interest, but the tribes won't accept it. The Black Hills are not for sale, they say. They want the land back, not payment for stolen property. Deadwood stands on that stolen land. The Chinese who rebuilt after smallpox faced constant discrimination. They were barred from owning mining claims under local ordinances. They were restricted to certain areas of town. They were charged a special tax, the Chinese tax, for the privilege of operating businesses. When they died, they were buried in a separate section of the cemetery, away from white residents. The few African Americans in Deadwood encountered the same racism they'd faced everywhere else in America. They worked as laborers, cooks, laundry workers, rarely as miners or in other skilled positions. They faced segregation in housing, dining, and entertainment. Women in Deadwood occupied a strange position. Some, like brothel owner Dora DeFran or entrepreneur Lucretia Marchbanks, achieved a kind of independence and economic power impossible in civilized Eastern society. But others, probably most, were trapped. Trapped in prostitution by poverty, by lack of alternatives, by force. The dance hall girls and sporting women lived brutal, short lives. Many died young of disease, violence, suicide, or complications from abortion. They were buried in the outcast section of Mount Moriah Cemetery, separated even in death from respectable residents. It wasn't romantic. It was survival. And yet, for all its darkness, Deadwood represents something undeniably compelling. What happens when society's rules temporarily disappear? When law is absent and order hasn't yet arrived, when human nature, both noble and brutal, operates without constraint. For 3 years, from 1876 to 1879, Deadwood was arguably the freest and most dangerous place in America. Free to succeed, free to fail, free to build, free to destroy, free to live, and free to die. That brief, impossible moment when Deadwood was the freest and most dangerous place in America. When men sang in saloons and died in streets, when fortunes were won and lost overnight, when disease killed more than gunfighters ever did, when the West was still wild and anything was possible.